founder of VBACFacts.com, Jen Campbell, and more on this episode of All Things Women's Health. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist of some 30 plus years. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a small business owner. I guess I'm a lot of things. But right now, I'm your host as we talk about all things women's health. Everything from menstrual problems to mammograms, infertility to childbirth options. It doesn't matter. If it affects women and their health, it's on our agenda. And our agenda today includes what I think is probably one of my favorite all-time topics, vaginal birth after cesarean, or VBAC, or VBAC, as we like to say. Now, for more than 30 years, I've been rambling on about VBAC. And it doesn't matter if I'm traveling to talk to a group of physicians at a conference or a group of maybe birth workers or patients, or if I'm just in the office talking to a patient and her husband about VBAC, the first thing I do is I go to a resource that I think is the greatest resource that's ever been for all things VBAC. It's VBACFacts.com. It is an absolute treasure of information, and anyone who knows anything about VBAC knows that that's where you go to get hot off the press information. Well, the amazing thing today is my guest is founder of VBAC Facts, Jen Campbell. And I'm so excited that she's decided to join us. And so please, help me welcome Jen Campbell. Jen, thanks so much for joining us.
I feel a little teary with that intro. That was just a very lovely introduction. Thank you.
Oh, well, but it's absolutely true. I mean, I talk a lot to patients about the 4 pillars of VBAC success, and we can get into that later. But one of them, I call it aggressive education. And under that heading is VBAC Facts, and that's you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It is an honor to be here. I am so excited. We met years ago at a conference in Indiana when I spoke, and we have been in contact. We're in each other's orbits, and I love it. I love watching the work that you do. And what people don't know is that I'm going to be interviewing you for my podcast. So this is really fun because we both get to share our knowledge and perspective with our respective audiences. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Well, you have to start by sharing with viewers some of your story because it's a fascinating one. They can read about it on your website. But, how did all of this come to be?
Well, I was kind of an unusual child in that I loved reading books about childbirth and parenting, even as a little girl. I remember being 9 or 10, and my mom was a nurse, and we would have books in the house, and I just found the whole process fascinating. And I even thought about becoming an obstetrician, and I was very excited to experience labor. I was so curious, what will that feel like? What will that be like? And, one of the great answers that I got when I experienced labor for myself, I really wanted to know, what does a contraction feel like? And so for those of you who've never felt one, it feels just like a Charlie horse in your calf that wakes you up in the middle of the night, but it's in your uterus, which is so hard to comprehend, right? Because I think of my uterus as a very different muscle than what's in my calf. I'm a hiker, so I've got some good calves. I mean, that's a chunk of meat, versus your uterus, which is this relatively small organ that just stretches to such capacity. And the fact that thin layer of muscle can create that level of power and energy, it was fascinating to experience. But to back up a little bit. So there I was. My husband and I were married. We decided, I was 27 years old, and the doctor, or maybe even 26, I can't remember exactly how old I was. And my doctor was like, well, do you want to have children? And I said, well, yeah, and someday, that inevitable someday. He was like, well, what are you waiting for? And I was sort of like,
good question.
You're not getting any older, and you're not getting any younger. And I thought, oh, gosh, yeah, that's kind of true. I mean, I guess this is something that I have to be kind of intentional about. Whether because we've always said we wanted to have kids, and yet it wasn't something that we were actively trying to make happen. In fact, we were actively preventing it. So, I came home to my husband. He loves to share this story. He's like, well, you came home and you said, well, we're going to start a family. And I was like, well, I guess I did. I mean, that is kind of who I am. So there we started our journey, and I got pregnant relatively easily. And was working in commercial real estate, which is what I did in my professional world. I was performing demographic and geographic analysis for local, national, and international companies who were evaluating their real estate options. So what that looked like is, again, is it any surprise to people who know me that I love numbers, I love statistics, I love spreadsheets. And so essentially what GIS, Geographic Information Systems, is it's tying an Excel spreadsheet where we have those records of data with a geographic region. So whether that geographic region is something like a block group, which is what the US Census uses to aggregate census data, and we can get incredibly detailed information from block groups, or you can look at metropolitan statistical areas, which are larger areas like in Southern California, that would be like LA County, Orange County, Riverside County. Those, I think it's been a while since I've been doing that. So I think those are all still one MSA. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but suddenly,
Anyways.
listening to you describe that, suddenly your podcasts are making more sense to me now. The level of detail and the level of research, it fits. I get it.
Exactly. So anyways, I'm sorry, level of detail, I'm going way into detail. And anyways, so I was doing this work, right? And I really enjoyed it. And I was working from home 3 days a week. And what I didn't realize at the time is what it meant to sit in a recliner for 8, 12 hours a day with my computer on my lap working. And later in my pregnancy, my midwife was like, your baby is transverse.
Oh.
And I said, oh, well, that doesn't sound good. So we scheduled an appointment with the OB that she collaborated with, and he performed an external cephalic version, which is when someone tries to externally turn the baby into a head down position. And my baby was not budging. And so I was given this little Xeroxed form that had been Xeroxed, 10,000 times before me with my little surgery date written in. And I walked out of that hospital so deflated. I was like, wow, I'm this weirdo who wants to actually experience labor. And here I'm going to end up having a C-section. And I was just so bummed out. And so then began my journey of like everything you could possibly do to encourage a baby to turn. I was doing it. I had my butt up in the air. I had peas on my stomach. I played music. We tried moxibustion. Went to chiropractors. I tried the Webster technique. I mean, I was doing everything I could. And I think it was about 37 weeks maybe when we had the version. I think that's when it was. And, as you know, but I'm sharing for the audience, people want to wait that long because in the event that you go into preterm labor, they want the baby to be term.
Right.
So I'm pretty sure it was 37, 38 weeks.
Yeah.
So I had my C-section scheduled for, I think it was like maybe 39 weeks. And a couple days before my C-section date. Oh, well, and let me just say this. Once I got that piece of paper, the idea that I would go into labor was completely out the door, right? I'm like, well, I've got this piece of paper and it's got the date on it.
It's all fixed. Yeah.
So the idea of me going into labor like that had just completely removed from my mind. It was so funny. And maybe because I was just so focused on getting that baby to turn that is where my emphasis was. And so when I woke up in the middle of the night and felt what felt like a dam break between my legs, I mean, I actually was having a dream and it felt like there were waves of water going between my legs like the ocean. And I woke up and I was like, oh, that's weird. And then I realized, oh, my bed is wet. And so called the doctor. It was like 2 a.m. So we drove down to the hospital about an hour away because I specifically wanted, because, I'd hired a nurse midwife who worked at this beautiful hospital in Laguna Beach, whose L&D unit has since closed. And I really wanted her collaborating physician, the one who did my external cephalic version, to perform my C-section because he understood midwifery care. He understood that, while I was excited to see my baby, I wasn't someone who was choosing to have a C-section. So It was a little bit of a different dynamic than someone who was like, I don't want to labor, I just want my C-section.
Right.
This is going to be awesome. I was sort of like, okay, this is what I got to do.
Yeah.
So, and at this point, my baby was a single footling breech. So that's another thing I left out. So she had her head, I can still feel it, her head under one rib, my left rib, her foot under the other rib, and then one foot down. Oh, that was a good time. So So we head on down to the hospital. I'm admitted. The OB's like, well, you'll be the first C-section of the day. Well, they check me and I was 4 centimeters and contractions had started.
Oh my.
So I actually got to experience what contractions were like, and that was great.
Right.
And I just remember thinking, like, I wish I could just do this the way, rather than having the C-section. So had the C-section. My OB was incredibly compassionate, and he permitted my husband to videotape it, which was wonderful. And I don't know how common that is anymore, given, that was almost 21 years
I think
ago.
it really varies by location. Yeah.
I mean, it was so special to me because I felt so disconnected from the whole process. I can't feel anything. I can't see anything. Clear drapes weren't a thing then. And honestly, I don't know if I would want a clear drape just because I don't know. The incision and the baby. I feel like I can handle a lot of things, but and I can totally watch that on someone else's body, but my own body, I think that would be like a whole nother level of weirdness to like be completely numb and yet see. Yeah. So my baby was born. My OB said, you'd be a great candidate for VBAC next time.
Uh-huh.
And, you had your baby for breech. There's no reason why you can't do it. And I'm forever grateful that he planted that seed because when I left the hospital, so many well-meaning friends and family would say to me things that they thought was encouraging, like, well, next time you can just have another C-section. And that was not what I wanted at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I had gone into that surgery. I'd had a little bit of a cold, so I was coughing. So anytime I would feel like I would need to cough in the postpartum period, I'm grabbing a pillow and applying counter pressure. And I had inverted nipples, so I had a real hard time breastfeeding. That's like a whole nother podcast and journey, which I ultimately was able to breastfeed, but it was just made more complicated.
Wow.
And and I had a rough postpartum period, and I was thinking, there is no way I want to do this again. If there is a way I can avoid this, that's what I'm going to do. And given who I am, and now you know a little bit about my background in terms of what I did, I mean, the first thing I was looking for was information,
Data.
right? Because while my OB told me I'd be a great candidate for VBAC, my friends and family and things I was reading online seemed to make VBAC seem like it was really dangerous and risky and only for like people who really didn't care about the health of their baby, for people who were adamant about getting the birth that they wanted. And I was so confused by that separation, that gap between what my OB said and what I was reading. So that's really the space where VBAC Facts was created, because I started collecting information for my own verification.
Yeah.
And back then, in 2004, it's hard to imagine, but I want everyone to conceive of a world before social media, when there was no Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn or anything like that. We had these things called Yahoo groups, and it was all email-based. And so the International Cesarean Awareness Network had a Yahoo group, and somehow I came across it and joined it. And that was one of the many different Yahoo groups that I was involved with. And as people were asking questions and sharing information, I was taking notes. And if someone would ask a question and I thought, gosh, I really wonder if that's true, I would just start looking it up, just because I personally find that interesting. I love reading medical research. And I know, I mean, some people might be like, that's kind of crazy, but I really do enjoy it. I really enjoy it a lot. So I just started collecting information, collecting the questions that people would ask, the challenges that they came upon. And when I got pregnant again, I had an incredible VBAC with my son, and it was an entirely different experience in terms of that postpartum period. I mean, as opposed to hardly being able to walk that first 24 hours after my C-section and needing to have my mom under one arm and the nurse under another so I could hobble to the bathroom, I was able to get up almost immediately after delivery and go to the bathroom by myself. I was able to take a shower. That first 24 hours is a little bit foggy, but that shower, I was able to take a shower within the first 24 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, just those small things made me feel so human. Being able to say roll around, like change positions in bed without waking up to pain. Being able to, we lived in a tri-level house. And so you walk in and the living room was on that middle floor and our bedroom was up a flight of stairs, and having to go up and down those stairs, that's a challenge with a C-section.
Sure.
Using the restroom is a challenge with a C-section.
Yeah.
It was incredible how much that incision impacted my life hourly. And then I'm also caretaking a baby. And so to contrast that against what my VBAC recovery was like, I mean, it was night and day.
Wow.
Night and day.
A friend of mine
so
many years ago said, you just reminded me, sort of a joke, what's the difference between an abdominal hysterectomy and a C-section? And the punchline is, after a C-section, you have a baby to take care of. But they really are similar procedures. In fact, I think I would argue in some ways the C-section is more brutal than the old-fashioned abdominal hysterectomy. But you just reminded me talking about just the little things that became big things because it is such a major surgery.
It is. And I think it has become so normalized because, 1/3 of U.S. births result in a C-section.
Right.
And there is this movement for people not to feel like shame or bad about their C-section. And I think no one should feel shame ever about how they birth, because whether you chose a birth, whether you chose to birth vaginally or have a C-section, or whether you ended up needing a C-section, there is no shame when it comes to birth. I feel like it's morally neutral how someone's baby is born. But in response to this feeling of judgment, there has been this, I'm having a hard time.
Almost less than it is. Definitely less than it is.
And there is an absolute range to how people can recover from a C-section. But I think we have to keep in mind, it is major surgery, and your abdominal muscles are tied to virtually every movement that you do. And then when you're trying to also nurse a baby, and you've got this very sensitive incision, and so you're trying to figure out a way to position your baby without knocking that incision, I mean, it's a challenge.
So you had a C-section, and then you were motivated to have a VBAC. It doesn't sound like you encountered a lot of barriers to your VBAC. So how did that translate into, I'm going to make VBAC possible for the world? Something got you really motivated after your VBAC.
Well, it was really seeing the injustice that was happening to countless parents.
Right.
How difficult it was for them to find accurate information. And that's not, and it's like, because we come across two different really camps of information. One is where the risks of VBAC are really exaggerated.
Sure.
And they want, for whatever reason, for people to just schedule elective repeat cesarean sections. But then you have this other camp where, in response to this exaggerated VBAC risk, you have this other camp where the risks of VBAC are really minimized. And people say, oh, the risk of uterine rupture is minuscule, or it's so rare, or it doesn't happen. And I found a real need, because neither of those messages resonated with me personally. And so I found a real need to have a resource for people who were more like me. And what I mean by that is people who wanted to plan a vaginal birth after cesarean, but also wanted to know what the data said. And that's where it started. And then I became a continuing education provider through the California Board of Registered Nursing, because I saw the need for more birth professionals to have accurate information about VBAC. Because I was shocked to find out that all the way from medical students to midwifery students to nursing students, the VBAC education that they receive can vary wildly. And I like to share, I was just interviewing someone today for my podcast, sharing about how there is a medical school close to me, and there is a professor there who teaches that VBAC is dangerous, and that's why physicians recommend repeat C-sections. And I've had the opportunity, the wonderful opportunity, to engage with 2 medical students that have been in classes with this professor, and to say to them, well, isn't it curious that the American College of OBGYNs encourages access to VBAC? And they just looked at me. And I said, you might be interested to read what the professional guidelines are, because you might find there's some differences between what you've been taught and what the national guidelines recommend. And you can examine, why do you think that difference is there? Because they were talking to me, they didn't know what I did. They just see me as, another little happy mother trotting down the road. They didn't realize that I had this sort of insider information. So the way they were talking to me was, well, they don't want you to plan a VBAC because it's really dangerous. And then I respond with them referencing ACOG. So, that it gives me an insight of what people are running into.
I like to assume good intent, but you remind me, talking about this professor, what's your feeling? Because I'd like to think the people that have that opinion, or that are propagating sort of that opinion, they're not evil people, just ill-informed. But what do you think drives that, especially among physicians, that sense of, oh, well, nobody in their right mind would want a VBAC? Because it isn't the information from groups like ACOG. So what is it in your experience that you think drives people to feel that way? I have my own idea.
Well, it's hard for me to separate my experience from the knowledge that I have read in medical research based on surveys from physicians on this very topic. And so the topic that comes up again and again and again is concern about litigation.
Oh, certainly.
They don't want to be sued. And the perception is that if I allow someone for labor after a cesarean and they have a uterine rupture and, God forbid, their baby dies, I will be held responsible for that.
Right.
And I would love to change this whole conversation that we have about liability, which is absolutely possible when we move from a more paternalistic approach to medicine to a more collaborative approach to medicine, where informed consent is really honored. And that means that people are given the risks and benefits for their options, and they are created, and then space is created for them to make that informed decision. And in making that informed decision, they now own the outcomes of that decision.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it is within their body that either they will have a victorious birth, a uterine rupture, a placenta accreta, a hysterectomy. Their body is the body that is going to hold the outcomes for that decision.
Yeah.
And so they need to, one, be comfortable with the risks and benefits of the options that they choose, but two, also know that when you make this choice, your provider, your clinician is going to do everything in their power to prevent an adverse outcome in the event that you have a uterine rupture or some other complication. But we have to stop holding physicians to this standard of they are like godlike creatures who can prevent any sort of bad outcome.
Yeah. It's interesting. I feel like, I've always felt like it's a bias. As a surgeon, I feel like all surgeons, that I'm just a wonderful surgeon, right? But if something bad happens in surgery, I don't feel like a bad surgeon. But if something happens in VBAC, I feel like a bad doctor, because that's sort of what the world is saying. But I know you know this phrase, and I detest it, but acceptable complication. So if you get an infection in your wound after a surgery, no one thinks it's a bad surgery. You think, well, that happens with surgery. It's one of those things that happens with surgery. So it's almost like C-section complications don't count because it's surgery after all. In my mind, I'm sort of taught to think, well, those are acceptable complications. But yet, at the same time, on the other side of that coin, VBAC complications, well, suddenly I'm responsible for that. I wasn't responsible from the other side, but now I'm responsible. So I agree with you completely. I don't think it's quite as simple as liability. I think it's even more complicated than that. It's liability, responsibility, accountability, and it's all mixed up.
Yeah, well, and liability is just one chunk.
Yeah.
I mean, there's other chunks.
Yeah.
But I will say about the liability, one of the things that I tell parents all the time, especially when we're talking about areas of unknown, potentially elevated risk. So things like if they have 3 prior cesareans and they want a VBAC, one of the things that I talk about is how important it is to understand, what does the evidence say? In a thumbnail, the evidence is very limited. We do not have good rates of uterine rupture after 3 cesareans in the medical literature. So when you don't have data like that, you have to be comfortable accepting, one, an unknown level of risk, And you have to be comfortable with that and okay with that. And counter that against what we know about the risks of a fourth C-section. And counter with that, how many more children do you want to have? So take that all into consideration. And then remember, your clinician is there as a lifeguard, and they are going to do what they can in the event that you have a uterine rupture to generate the best outcome possible. However, no one can guarantee an outcome in birth.
Yeah.
And so you have to be willing to hold the responsibility if you are that statistic and not blame your provider, because your provider is not your dad, your provider is not your husband, your provider is not your boss, your provider is not someone who tells you what to do. Your provider is someone who stands there with you, unlike your husband possibly. Your husband's not telling you what to do, but your provider is there as a lifeguard. And your provider is there to use the skills and knowledge that they have to generate the best outcome. But even in the best situations, we can have bad outcomes. And sometimes there is no one, quote, to blame. In the absence of malpractice, there is no one to, or negligence, there is no one to blame.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting. You said, you talk a lot about studies and the data, and you present the data or the information to people. And every time I hear you talk about it, a couple of things. One, I'm amazed at the level of detail that you will get into. But the other thing I think maybe a lot of us learned during the pandemic is an editorial about a research study is not the same thing as the research study. And
Yes.
I love the way that,
Yes.
if someone quotes a study that says, this will happen, you actually dig into how they came to that conclusion. And all too often, it's not a great conclusion that they came to. So it gets held up as this is the gospel. And then you have this ability to sort of dig in and figure out, was that really a logical conclusion or not? But that's not easy. This is your full-time job. That is not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not. And I love it. So one example is there was a Canadian study that came out a few years ago that talked about a 3 times greater risk of, I can't remember if it was perinatal death or fetal death with a trial of labor. And I was like, let's look into that. Because one of the things that we have to consider when we're looking at medical research is relative risk, such as how often does uterine rupture happen in a planned VBAC versus an elective repeat cesarean. So when we're comparing two things, that's relative risk. Absolute risk, and I know you know this, Chris, I'm saying this for the audience. Absolute risk is when we have something that's 1 in 500 versus 1 in 10,000. Relative risk is when we say that the risk of you being allergic to orange flowers is 5 times higher than red flowers.
Right.
Okay, so when we have that 5 times, that's relative risk versus absolute risk is when we have that concrete number.
Yeah.
So I immediately knew in reading the study, I'm like, this is a relative versus absolute risk thing. And of course, if, the media wants to write these headlines, just like anyone who writes blog
Sound
articles,
bites. Yeah,
or
that's right.
podcast titles, right?
Yeah.
We're writing it in a way to get the most eyeballs to read it, right? And so, of course, the most stunning thing from this study is that there is a 3 times greater risk. Well, I dove into it, and yes, that was the issue. And there was more to it. And if people are interested, they can go to vbacfacts.com and just go to the blog, search Canadian study, and it'll pop right up.
Yeah.
And in that article, I also talk about how I go through medical studies. What are the questions that I'm asking? What are the variables I'm looking for? And that's information that anyone can take and then use it as a template, as a rubric, when they look at medical research. One of those key things is, how did that study define uterine rupture? Uterine rupture is a full thickness opening through the uterine wall. That is different than a uterine dehiscence. That is not a full thickness opening.
Yeah.
Uterine rupture is an emergency. Uterine dehiscence is not. It's often asymptomatic. Often it happens and no one even knows that it happens, right? Unless someone needs a C-section for another reason and they're opened up and people can visualize the dehiscence, they're often unnoted. So I wonder how many times people have a vaginal birth and yet they have a uterine dehiscence and it's never even noted.
What makes me crazy in that realm is all of that data is based typically on charge information, meaning what was billed. And that's based on a clerical person interpreting what I put in the chart. I might not have written dehiscence, or I might have written uterine window, or I might have put some other slang in. And some poor soul had to translate that into something for the billing department to use. But then a lot of those research studies come right out of the billing information, and it can be very, very misleading.
Well, exactly. And so this is the problem, is that that uterine dehiscence in the medical records comes to that person, that clerk, and they look at it and
Yeah,
they have to decide how are they going to code it. Well, there is no ICD-10 code for uterine dehiscence.
right.
So they either get to choose, I'm going to code it as uterine rupture, or I'm going to not code that event. Well, is it right not to code the event? How should I code the event? So there's a country in Europe who actually created their own equivalent of ICD-10 codes for uterine rupture, and they added 2 important codes. And I try to talk about this as much as possible because I would love to have something like this replicated in the US. So what they did was they have a code for uterine rupture, right, which is what we have right now in the US with ICD-10 codes. They have a code for suspected uterine rupture. So say all the signs and symptoms are there for a uterine rupture, you go in, you do your crash C-section, and there's no uterine rupture. Okay, well, you can still code for that you thought there was, but then there wasn't. Then they have a code for uterine dehiscence. So that way, no matter what the clinical scenario is, you're able to code it accurately. And then when people go pull medical research from those codes, you're able to know exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And so that's the real challenge. And that's where it's one of the challenges. And that's where we get into this conversation of, well, do we really know how often uterine rupture occurs? The answer is yes. And that's when we look at studies that are based on medical records and not diagnosis codes. That's how we know what the real rate of uterine rupture is. And when they distinguish between uterine rupture and uterine dehiscence, in their methods section, you know when those people are going through the medical records, they're saying, oh, Chris wrote uterine dehiscence. Okay, that's not a uterine rupture. Or Chris wrote uterine rupture. Okay, we know where to code that now. So and that is a real problem because then when we look at these incredible databases we have for nationwide data, and we want to pull this research from these databases, we're not always getting uterine ruptures. We're getting uterine dehiscences that were inaccurately coded.
Right.
And in fact, that's what that study that I was referencing out of Europe talked about. They actually went through and cross-sectioned all the medical records for all the births that were coded as uterine rupture. And what they found was shocking of how often uterine rupture was under and over-reported because of these coding issues. And when we have something that happens as rarely as uterine rupture, especially in the absence of a prior cesarean, those few coding errors can result in a significant reporting disparity.
You know, if there's a takeaway, I'm sure there's a lot of takeaways from listening to you, but I think if viewers get one thing from this discussion, it would be whenever something is quoted about the medical literature, the first thing to do is pause and take a breath. I mean, this happened to me once, and I'll have to be vague so no one can figure out what I'm talking about, but I was testifying, and the person testifying on the other side quoted a study that supported their position. Well, then when you looked at the study, it turned out that study actually didn't support their position at all. They were misquoting that study. And that's even another level of problem. Not even that the data was bad, but the data was misquoted. So whether you're talking about vaccines or weight loss or VBAC or anything else in medicine, I think the first thing to do when you hear something quoted from the medical literature, take a breath. And then maybe the next thing is you get your hands on that actual study and start looking at it. Or you go to a place like VBAC Facts where somebody brilliant like you has taken the time to do that for you. Because not everyone is going to go live in the basement of the library and look at studies, but it's a problem. And it's not necessarily malice on the part of the people quoting or misquoting. They didn't take the time to dig into that study the way you do either.
Exactly. Let me just give you one more example, although we could be here all day, but I'll just give you one more example. So there was a study on vaginal birth after 3 cesareans, and they didn't have any uterine ruptures, and they had really good outcomes. And people will pull that out and be like, look at this study. It was really great, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
There were 89 people in that study. So when you have only 89 people in a study, and you're measuring something like uterine rupture, 89 people, when you have a small sample size, you can either have that unlikely event happen more often than you anticipate. Say it happens 5 times. Okay, can we say 5 divided by 89 is an accurate rate of uterine rupture?
Right.
No, we can't. Say it happens 0 times. Okay, so can we say, well, uterine rupture never happens? We can't do that either. So this is another thing that I look at is what is the sample size? So like you said, people quote studies all the time. They often don't really know what they're talking about. And so that becomes a real challenge. And I will say, this is why I started doing policy consulting as well as a legal expert witness work, because attorneys in the court, they have obstetricians who come up and talk about VBAC. And of course, they're like this OB at the local medical school, right?
Right.
It's not that they have malice. It's just for whatever reason, they're coming up and they are pretty much regurgitating the conventional wisdom about VBAC to the court and acting as if this is what the truth is, rather than this perspective that so many OBs have about VBAC in America is not only based on the evidence, it is also based on our cultural values about vaginal birth here in the US. It's based on fear and misinformation. It's based on liability, which we talked about. There's a lot of different factors. And when we look at other countries that have VBAC rates that are in the high 20% to even maybe 30%, they have a completely different cultural approach to birth.
Yeah.
Vaginal birth is the default, whether you've had a C-section or not. It's not viewed as high risk. It breaks my heart when I see parents in the US who are pregnant after 1 cesarean. They are healthy. They have 1 prior low transverse cesarean, and they're telling me how they have a high-risk pregnancy. You don't have a high-risk pregnancy just because you had 1 prior low transverse cesarean. And yet, that is what is communicated to them by their provider, because that's how their provider is seeing the situation. And when your provider comes in with this energy of you are a high-risk birth, that comes off onto the parent, and they're like, oh, I'm a high-risk birth. No one's high risk.
Yeah.
We need this calm, confident energy in the room.
You make me want to change from sort of hard science to maybe softer science a little. You mentioned the word experience earlier, and this is something I think we see all of the time in birth, and it's a phrase that I know you detest as well, but it's when someone says to a mom, well, after all, what we really want is a healthy mom and a healthy baby. I think it's one of the most insulting things that a healthcare worker can say to a mom. But, why is it, I'm being a little rhetorical, but why is it that birth experience matters? People don't say, I had my gallbladder out and it really wasn't a good experience. I hope my next surgery is a better experience. My feeling is that on the medical side, we tend to equate birth with a gallbladder. It's a medical procedure. But, how do you speak to that? Why does birth experience matter?
Well, when we look, there's so many things going through my head when you ask me that question. First of all, obstetrics and gynecology is a medical specialty. So thus, it is viewed as a medical procedure, like a knee replacement. Okay, but the difference is that it's not a knee replacement. It's not like getting my teeth cleaned. It is probably one of the most intimate and transformational medical procedures. For those who aren't watching, I've got my hands up in quotes, medical procedures that a woman or person can undergo. Is a vaginal birth a medical procedure? I would argue no.
No.
A medical procedure is what happens when vaginal birth goes off course and intervention is required. That's when we start to have medical interventions. But if you are just having a regular vaginal birth, that is not a medical procedure. And so that, and the power, I can think of other times in my life where I have done things physically challenging and I have felt that sense of, wow, I really am a badass. I'll give you a quick example. My family, we are a pretty active family. So we went and planned this bike ride around Mammoth in Central California. And we looked at the trolley schedule and we thought, okay, so we're going to ride down the mountain, we're going to ride around the city, and then we're going to catch the trolley and head on back up to where our car is parked. And it was going to be like 20 miles of bike riding, right? And the drop in elevation from where our car was parked to where we drove down to the city was about 2,000 feet. So we were going to bike down, ride around, and take the trolley out. We were like, okay, great, we got our plan. Well, we get to the trolley after all of our bike riding and realize we had misread the schedule and the trolley was in fact not running. And beyond that, we had about an hour and a half, 2 hours of light left. And because we had been riding our bikes so long, our watches had died, our cell phones had died, and we didn't have headlamps, and we were in an area that did not have external lighting. I mean, the things were piling up, right? And there was nothing to do but ride our bikes up this hill. And it was my husband, our 2 kids, and because we're crazy, we had our dog, our 60-pound dog, and a bike trailer that my husband and I were switching back and forth, hauling up this mountain. Oh my gosh. I mean, there were so many moments where I was like, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this.
Sounds like labor.
And at the end, we did it. And I cannot even tell you the feeling of utter and complete satisfaction we all had as we gathered there in the parking lot literally 20 minutes of sunlight left. It was dark in 20 minutes. We were so starving. We opened up the car. We sat on the parking lot ground, pulled out our backpacking equipment, and we're heating up food there in the parking lot because we were all so famished and exhausted. And within probably 45 minutes, it was too cold for us to be outside. That was a moment. My daughter actually wrote her college essay with that experience as the framework.
Wow.
That is one of those moments in my life where I look at myself and I think, I am so much more capable than what I think. I mean, here I really thought my reserves were gone. And I pushed through and I did it. That is an inkling of what I personally experienced when I had my VBAC.
Yeah.
That knowing of how powerful my body is, of how much I can do. I mean, and people want to poo-poo that. People want to diminish it. You know, it is one of the most powerful things that someone
Yeah, one of our
can
midwives
experience.
came on this show, and I'll misquote her, but she had a vaginal breech birth, and she said, you know, doing that defined me as a person and as a woman.
Yeah.
That sort of stuck with me. But if we stick with the analogy that I used, I've never heard anyone come out of their gallbladder surgery and say, that defined me as a person, because they're not the same thing. But
They're
the
not the
system is
same
sort of
thing.
set up to treat them the same way. Yeah.
Well, and I came out of that birth. I mean, that birth. So I learned a few things. I came out of that birth with 3 key pieces of information. One, there was nothing in this world I couldn't do. I'm like, if I can do that, I can do anything. And then the second thing was thinking back to all the people who I'd interacted with, because there are 3.5 years between my kids. So that's a fair amount of time to be reading, engaging with other people, collecting information. And I just thought of all the people who were told by their OB, well, you can't do that. It's too dangerous. In contrast to national guidelines and medical evidence. So there's nothing in this world I couldn't do. There's massive injustice in the world. And number 3 was I was going to do something about it. That is the power that came from my VBAC. So when we talk about where VBAC facts came from, it came from that birth and the person who I was transformed into through that birth. And you can hear my voice cracking. It's true.
That's powerful.
It is really true. And so for people to be denied that opportunity to feel the strength and wonder of their bodies and learn how strong you are and how you really can do anything, that is, I mean, it's just robbing people of so much.
And robbing them based on a false premise, which makes it even more devastating, I think.
Yes.
That's interesting. Now, you, more than anybody I certainly know, have your finger on the pulse of American VBAC. I mean, what's your sense across the country of where are we, and maybe more importantly, where do you think we're headed?
Well, when I had my first C-section, the VBAC rate in the U.S. was 8%, and now we're at about 14%, and that's over 21 years. So, you know, we could look at that a few different ways. We could look at that and say, oh my gosh, this is happening so slowly.
Yeah.
Or we can look at that and say, wow, the VBAC rate has almost doubled in the U.S.
Right.
We are in an upward trajectory. And the 2020 people goal was to have the VBAC rate nationwide be 18%. Okay, well, we're 2025 now.
Sure.
And it was so interesting because when the Healthy People 2023 metrics were released, VBAC was not on that agenda. And I was so disheartened because I couldn't help but feel that the person who was at the table championing VBAC to be included wasn't there when the 2023 guidelines were put together. So shout out, if you are involved with the 2040 guidelines, I want to be at the table. I need to be at that table because there is no one in this country who has the intersection of the personal experience, the thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of stories I hold in my heart, intersected with the incredible encyclopedic level of knowledge that I have about VBAC. I need to be at that table because the voices of these people in the US who have birthed victoriously, who have been deceived, who have been denied, who have fought through, who have traveled for hours for their VBAC, they deserve for their experiences to be honored. And we all deserve evidence-based care and respectful health care. And that needs to come down from the federal level.
Yeah, I hear you. I think what troubles me, and at the risk of sounding a little cynical in the last stage of my career, is that the shift that we've seen to physician employment. So roughly 75% of physicians are employed by big hospital systems. And I worry about the destruction of physician autonomy. Yes, I believe in VBAC. I went to VBAC Facts. I heard that Kamel lady, she's impressive, but I'm employed and my employer says we don't do VBACs. And so what's the employed physician do? They're not going to quit their job. They're going to stop doing VBACs. And much like forceps in obstetrics, it's always sort of one generation away from just disappearing. So I hope I'm dead wrong on that, but I could see it being a challenge. Now, at the same time, I feel like there could be a pendulum swinging back towards independent medical practice from employed medical practice, and I'd like to see that because I think that could help. But it will be interesting to see. We've made some great progress. I hope the trajectory continues to be positive.
Well, I have a couple thoughts on that, if you would like to hear what my thoughts are. So number one, when we talk about administration dictating healthcare, right there is an opportunity, like any other metric at the hospital, for that physician to go around, find their allies, find other people who want to support VBAC. That might require some VBAC education. That's why VBAC Facts professional membership is there. So we can provide you with that level of education and knowledge so you can effectively argue for your hospital to offer VBAC and start advocating for change at your facility. Nothing will change if people just say, okay, I just won't attend VBAC then. I understand that position because I understand that not everyone has the capacity to be the advocate. But once you start building your team and you start collecting, oh, look, here's the nurses who want VBAC, and here's some anesthesiologists who are supportive of VBAC, and here's some midwives who are supportive of VBAC, and here's a couple other physicians, maybe there's family physicians who are trained in a cesarean birth who want to attend VBAC. You get this group together, and now it's not just you. Now you have a group of people, and you get more people together, and you can effectuate change at your facility. You can be the person who changes VBAC access in your community. That is within your power. So that's number one. Number two is I do see an opportunity for a shift. So we have independent surgical sites for a whole slew of different types of medical care. I'm thinking specifically of plastic surgery in my mind right now. But we could have things that are like birth centers, but also have the capacity for surgery. And these could be just like birth centers owned by midwives. These could be birth centers very close to a hospital. So in the event that you need blood or you need other advanced care that isn't available at the birth center, you can access that, but to at least be able to offer surgery. If you need to, and then because you are an independent birth center, you can make the rules. You and the people who are in your group practice can decide, do we want to attend VBAC? I hope the answer is yes. And then be able to run your facility as you see fit. The thing is that we need more people who have the courage and the confidence and the knowledge to join us in this movement to ensure that people have access to evidence-based care. Because one thing we have not discussed today, I mean, there's a lot, Chris, we could talk all day, but one thing we haven't discussed is the incidence of placenta accreta and the devastating outcomes that people experience when they have multiple prior cesareans or even one prior cesarean, and they develop placenta accreta, increta, or percreta. And on my podcast, I'm going to be interviewing a woman who I met years ago when I was speaking out in Virginia, who had had multiple prior cesareans, was never mentioned accreta was an issue, or accreta could be an issue in her future, developed placenta percreta, and had to go from Virginia to Texas, where there is an accreta specialty center, and spend weeks there because she was such a high-risk birth. We don't talk about that.
No, that's
we are
that's
so
not listed
focused on
that's not listed on the complications of a repeat C-section or a primary
it's
section.
not.
Yeah, and it should.
And so that's one of the questions I asked parents. I said, so were you ever informed on the risk of accreta? No. Were you ever talked about how you give birth now could impact your future births? No. That is a conversation that all clinicians should have, because that is part of when we talk about risks and benefits. Typically what we see on the VBAC side is uterine rupture. What do we see on the C-section side? People really remain quiet.
It's those acceptable risks we talked about earlier. Right, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But we have to talk about placenta accreta, especially if someone's having that first C-section. They may very well want 2, 3, 4, 5 more children. You don't know unless you ask. Yeah. So we have to ask those questions, because placenta accreta not only has a higher rate of maternal mortality and morbidity than uterine rupture, but we're also talking about a significantly higher rate of hysterectomy ending someone's fertility.
Sure.
That needs to be part of this conversation, because when people have informed consent conversations and it's all about the risks of VBAC and there's no risks associated with repeat cesarean, or it's like you might get an infection, of course people are going to choose a repeat cesarean.
That's not consent, that's coercion, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But people claim that's informed consent,
Exactly.
or that is the informed consent conversation that parents often receive.
Sure.
And so they feel like they are making the safest decision for them because of how it's been positioned. So, placenta accreta, that is something that we're seeing increase. And placenta accreta is now the number one cause for peripartum hysterectomy in industrialized, well-resourced countries. Yeah. And that is directly tied.
For the record, it's not a straightforward hysterectomy. It's a very complicated, high-risk hysterectomy that could result in all sorts of hysterectomy complications. So it's not to be taken lightly by any means.
Well, and I would love, can you just spend a couple seconds talking about how a peripartum hysterectomy is different than like my grandmother at 80 having hysterectomy? Because I don't think people really understand what that difference is.
Yeah, other than being spelled the same way, they have nothing in common. Right? That's true. When we have to do a C-section hysterectomy, as we sometimes call it, where at the C-section we have to convert to hysterectomy, or immediately or shortly after birth, we have to do a hysterectomy. It's a radically different procedure. I mean, as you referenced at the very beginning, the uterus goes from being something maybe the size of your fist to something maybe the size of a basketball. The blood flow to the uterus is many, many times greater than it is in the non-pregnant or non-peripartum or near pregnancy. So the bleeding is much greater. The technical ability to do the C-section is very complicated. The probability of injuring the tubes that come from the kidneys to the bladder, called the ureters, very, very high. If those are injured, you may lose that kidney. You may have to have additional surgery or surgeries. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. So anyone who tries to present a peripartum hysterectomy as a benign endeavor is either being untruthful or they've never done one, because it is a serious, serious endeavor. But as you point out, that's never presented as a potential sequelae, as we like to say. You remind me of another phenomenon that's so troubling, and that is, if we think of the universe of providers that will do a VBAC after one C-section, whatever that number is, it's much smaller after 2 C-sections. And if someone is choosing to have a repeat C-section for that next time, they may unknowingly be deciding VBAC is never an option for them, because unless they're in a community where there's a diversity of providers that would maybe do VBAC after 2, they've just limited their birth options for the rest of their reproductive career. And I don't feel like that's ever pointed out, or at least not often enough.
Yeah, it's very rarely pointed out, but I point it out quite often.
You
I
do.
actually just did an Instagram reel on this very topic because when we look at how a prior C-section impacts planned vaginal birth. So when someone has no prior C-sections, about 80% of people are like, yeah, I'm going to have a vaginal birth, and they labor. Only 20% have an elective C-section. Those numbers flip-flop after just one prior C-section.
Right.
So now we have 80% of people having elective repeat C-sections and only 20% of people laboring. That, once someone has that second C-section, as you said, it drops off considerably.
Right.
Now we have 93% of people scheduling elective repeat C-sections and only 7% of people laboring. Now that's per nationwide data. We have new, more recent data out of the state of California that says that only 3% of people with 2 prior cesareans actually labor in that next pregnancy.
Wow, that's
So
impressive.
when we talk about it falling off,
Yeah.
it absolutely is. And that's another thing that, like you said, people aren't told, and they need to be told when they are pregnant after one C-section. This is your best shot. Not only is this your best shot, but your risks right now are as low as they're ever going to be. Because if you have another C-section, the risks increase. And when we talk about what are the risks, uterine rupture, not super clear. We have an article up on the website, vaginal birth. If you go to vbacfacts.com/VBA2C, we have a whole article about that. And you can see why we don't have great numbers on uterine rupture. But the things that unequivocally increase, the risk of placenta accreta, the risk of hysterectomy, the risk of obstetric hemorrhage, which obstetric hemorrhage is one of the primary drivers for maternal mortality, maternal deaths in the U.S.
In the world.
So when you were talking,
that's right.
Yeah. So when you talk about the peripartum hysterectomy and the bleeding, I wanted to be like, risk of mortality, because your risk of mortality is substantially higher in that scenario.
Yeah.
So ICU admission, the risk of obstetric hemorrhage, as well as blood transfusions. So those risks increase. So that is something we have to keep in mind. With each prior C-section, that makes the subsequent C-section even more precarious.
Exactly.
But again, that's not often shared. The whole focus is on VBAC, uterine rupture, and how dangerous that is.
Now,
and I think it's time for people to have accurate information about both options.
And I know that you know, but I'll say for our viewers, you can hear our enthusiasm as we talk about VBAC, and you can think that we're suggesting that there are no risk with one, and there's zero. There's lots of risk with one and zero risk with the other, and it gets back to your earlier comment about relative risk. If you're pregnant and you've had a prior cesarean section, you only have 2 choices. You have to either have a repeat C-section, or you have to have a VBAC. There's not a third option, and that, unfortunately, you have risk with both options, and you have to choose the risk that you feel better about. But I think where you and I spend so much of our energy is getting you the right information to make that decision, because there's risk with both choices.
Yes.
I like the fact that I think the risk of catastrophe with both choices, fortunately, is very, very low, and they start to look pretty similar. Well, then that's a radically different discussion than it is if there was a safer alternative. I would be advising patients every minute of every day, take the safe option. But there's not a safer alternative, as we know. And our enthusiasm could be misinterpreted, but we're trying to say choose between 2 risks with good information, and that's what's lacking.
Exactly. And 2 different sets of risk. So that's the thing. It's like your risk of uterine rupture with a VBAC is relatively much higher than with an elective repeat C-section.
Sure.
But your risk of placenta accreta is much higher in that subsequent pregnancy if you have an elective repeat than a VBAC.
That's a great point.
So it all depends, like what information is being stressed to you and who benefits based on what choice you ultimately make.
Oh, that's another whole podcast episode, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who benefits? One of my favorite podcasts of yours is your VBAC myths. I love that one.
Oh, thank you.
And as we sort of finish up, I have to ask you, What's your favorite VBAC myth to dispel?
Oh my gosh.
If you had
I
to choose
mean,
one, what's your favorite?
so you know that podcast episode, I have 40 plus VBAC myths I dispel. And it's really, gosh, there's so many good ones. It's like choosing my favorite child. You're really going to make me choose.
That's not fair.
Okay. It's not fair. Okay. I'm just going to tell you what comes off the top of my head. The risk of, like, you can't be induced after a C-section.
Oh, that's a great one. Very good. Yeah.
I love sharing. Now, again, this is all about relative risk, right? So if I could just briefly share why that is a myth. There are situations where the baby needs to be born, but not in the next 5 minutes, right? If it's the next 5 minutes, that's an emergency C-section. But there are circumstances where the baby needs to be born sooner rather than later, and we can't wait around, or the risks are higher if we wait around for spontaneous labor. Right. So that is a situation where if induction is off the table, your only options are to wait for spontaneous labor with whatever this complication is and discuss the risks and benefits, or have a C-section. Well, we are in a scenario here where there is a third option, and that's an induction. And how induction is conducted matters after a C-section, and we have a whole training about that within VBAC Facts professional membership. So, but the idea that now you've had a C-section, induction is off the table, there's nothing wrong with a Foley catheter, a slow drip of Pitocin, real gentle, and just see what happens. The C-section is always there. You can always do that. But if someone doesn't want a C-section and they really want a vaginal birth for whatever the numerous valid reasons they could have, let's make sure that's an option for people.
Well said. Yeah, that is a great myth busting. Thank you. But there's many, many more in that podcast of yours. I can't recommend it enough.
Well, go check it out, everyone. VBAC Facts podcast.
Well, as we wrap up, what do you say to our listeners that mostly are patients? There's a lot of nurses, I think, that listen. There might be one or two providers that listen, but what is the national VBAC guru that is you? What's your takeaway on this topic for them?
So for parents, I would say you are your own best advocate. And if you have never had what you perceive to be the strength to speak up for yourself, now is the time. There is no one on this planet who cares more about your baby or your body than you. Learn the facts, decide what feels right for you, find a provider who either supports that mission, or if you interview a provider and they're like, I don't think you should have a VBAC. Of course, if you can find a more supportive provider in your area, do that. But fundamentally, what you're looking for is someone who will honor your right to decline a cesarean. And so that is the question. Will you stand by me and be my lifeguard while I labor? If this is like the least worst option in your community, that is the question to ask. And then it's really about trust. Do you trust them to be honest with you about when they call that C-section? So that would be my advice for parents. For nurses, I would say, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. You have such a capacity to create change in your facility. You may not even know it, but I have to tell you the countless nurses that I have engaged with, educated, stood beside, who have told me stories of when they had the right information at the right time, and they were able to change the trajectory of a labor for the better because they had the facts.
Wow.
They were able to change policy at their hospital because they had the facts and the courage to stand up and do what is right. And you have that too. And I would say the same thing to providers. You have the capacity to be that beaming light in your community to provide evidence-based and respectful healthcare that so many parents want. There are so many parents who will travel hours and hours and hours with multiple small children in order to avoid a surgery. And if you are the person who provides VBAC in your community, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And please continue doing that. Please continue educating your colleagues. Please continue doing the right thing. We need more people willing to do the right thing, and you are one of them. So thank you, and keep on marching on. I am here with you.
Wow. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for VBACFacts.com. I can't say enough about it. If you've never visited that site, you've just got to go and go frequently and regularly, and because you're always putting new great stuff on there. But it is a tremendous resource, and thank you for your life's work to try to make this option more available for people than it has been.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me and allowing me to yammer on.
You have to promise to come back because we've only scratched the surface on a lot of great, great topics.
I mean, I can tell you all about the catalogs of demographic and geographic information that I could purchase for various analysis. I mean, there's got to be another mapping number dork out there, right?
Excellent. Well, viewers, thank you for spending a little bit of time. I hope you'll support Jen Kamel and VBACFacts.com. And thanks for watching us. Thanks for spending a little bit of time. Hope you'll come back for future episodes. I hope you'll share this episode with everybody you know and encourage them to come and listen as well. Join me again soon for another episode of All Things Women's Health.